Hey, this is Tom Webster, and this is Sounds Profitable for Wednesday, October 18th, 2023. Confused about video? The listeners aren't. While the podcast industry frequently debates what qualifies as a podcast, data from the podcast landscape shows that podcast listeners have a pretty good idea themselves. I'm going to break down that data and what it can mean for YouTube as the biggest place for podcast discovery. But first, if you're listening to this on the morning of October 18th, good morning. You've got just a few hours left to register for Sounds Profitable's latest research webinar, The Power of Brands and Podcasts, a podcast landscape study. Register now with the link in the show notes to get your free spot and join us at 2 p.m. Eastern. And if you are listening in the future, which is currently my future, but your present, the full study and webinar recording are available now on soundsprofitable.com. So video continues to throw a spanner into the podcast works. On the one hand, we know that YouTube specifically ranks very highly anytime you ask podcast listeners what platforms they ever use to consume podcasts. But on the other hand, dumping your podcast on YouTube without a visual component doesn't really work that well. With so many of the top podcasts in America also having a video counterpart, what are we supposed to make of the definition of a podcast today? One thing I've consistently said from the first time I talked about YouTube on stage at Podcast Movement 5 years ago was that YouTube was the best content search engine in the world. We have all spent loads of unplanned time clicking over to the recommended videos on the right side of the screen after watching the thing that we came there for in the first place. Whenever podcasters talk about the discovery problems in this medium, I think about this. The result of YouTube's increasing importance to the podcast space has been a fair amount of agita about whether or not we all have to become YouTubers and this is our life now. There is a clear advantage to having a podcast on YouTube if it has a compelling visual component. Even watching people talk into a microphone dramatically improves focus and comprehension. People can literally follow a conversation better if they have a focal point for each voice. But if you can't manage that, you probably are not going to get many plays, and you'll likely question what you're even doing there. What I hear even more from podcasters, though, is concern about what even is a podcast anymore. If podcasting and online video are all just the same thing, have we lost the special sauce of podcasting? Are we doomed to transition from being good at audio to mediocre video producers? Well, I've got some good news for you. While industry insiders might be confused about the shifting definitions of what a podcast is, the listeners actually aren't. In fact, in our most recent study from Sounds Profitable, the podcast landscape, which will be linked in the show notes, listeners made that quite clear in the answers to just two questions. First, when it comes to discovering new podcasts, recommendations are still the top channel, so you can increase your friends and family promotional budget now. But when you set recommendations aside, there's a clear number one source for podcast discovery, and that's YouTube. And that's about half of listeners said that YouTube was one of the ways they discovered podcasts. Half. Now, in technical terms, we call that a big number. YouTube isn't just number one on that list. It's 60% larger than number two. It's also nearly 4 times larger than Twitter/X, which is the easy button for podcast promoters. Seems to me that we kind of want to be on YouTube. But here's an even more interesting data point. When we asked people what they expected a podcast to be, the answer was pretty clear. 13% of respondents leaned towards video, either that a podcast was all or mostly video, with another 20% ambivalent about the whole affair. That left 2/3 of Americans 18 plus that expected a podcast to either always or usually be an audio medium. Not much confusion there. So while people who eat, sleep, and breathe podcasts every day worry about the changing definition of a podcast, and I count myself in that number, the listeners are still pretty clear. It's mostly an audio platform. So how do we square the fact that most people think podcasts are primarily an audio medium with the fact that YouTube is by far the top platform for podcast discovery. Some of this is down to the disproportionately large impact of a few podcasts. The fathead of an otherwise long-tail medium is really only a few hundred podcasts deep. And if you added up the non-duplicated reach of even just the top 25 multi-channel podcasts, those that are available both as an audio file through RSS and on YouTube, they would reach a sizable double-digit percentage of podcast listeners. And that could certainly explain why nearly half of podcast listeners say they've ever discovered a podcast on YouTube, but also think of podcasting as an audio medium. They may listen to most of their podcasts as audio. There is another way to think about this, however, and this is what I would suggest for the rest of us, a mindset shift. Instead of thinking about YouTube as a place to promote a podcast, imagine instead it's a place to promote a podcaster. So much of the YouTube economy revolves around individual creators, from Mr. Beast to that kid who opens up presents who's probably in jail or something by now. Podcasting's number one show, and you know who he is, might be exclusive to Spotify, but the person sure isn't. There are multiple clips from his show uploaded to YouTube every single day. Now, you may not be producing as much video as Joe Rogan, but could you produce something, even a short, that just promotes who you are and why people should care about a show that you make? Not a trailer. I don't think people actively look for trailers, but a short, interesting, and entirely self-contained bit of video that shows off why you and or your co-hosts are smart, capable, funny, and worthy of attention. Through that, they can discover you, and in discovering you, could be led to your podcast. I think the fact that a clear majority of Americans still see podcasting as an audio-centric medium should be reassuring to you. It is to me. I got into this business because I love audio, and I hate doing video, and I was not relishing the thought of having to wheel a bunch of ring lights into my living room. But I think we could all do something that demonstrates whether or not we are worthy of attention. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm heading off to film a bunch of reaction videos of me listening to podcasts for the first time while eating street food with a mouth microphone to catch that ASMR goodness. Thanks again for listening to this week's podcast, Confused About Video, the listeners aren't. This episode is hosted on Art19. I'm Tom Webster, and I'll see you next week.